So, so today is about unlocking the IRB approval process. The speakers today will be me. I'm Dr. Breanna Studenka. I'm the IRB Vice Chair, and I'm an Associate Professor in Kinesiology and Health Science. And then we also have Nicole Vouvalis. Nicole, did I say that right? I don't think I've ever said your name out loud.
Vouvalis, yeah.
Vouvalis. Okay, Nicole Vouvalis, who is the Executive Director of Human Research Protections. So I'll talk first, and then Nicole will kind of take over. All right, so the Institutional Review Board is an independent committee charged with the ethical review, revision, and approval of research involving human participants. The members of the USU's Institutional Review Board, we further the university's research mission by prospectively reviewing proposed research involving human participants. So our main aims are to protect those research participants. We follow the principles of justice, beneficence, and respect for persons in all of USU's research involving human participants. We create a culture of ethical concern, which basically means that we're involved in the process of creating a culture that deliberately establishes an environment where ethical considerations are prioritized and integrated into our everyday operations and decision-making processes. We prioritize the research participant interests, the interests of our research participants, and of course we have to comply with international, indigenous, sovereign, federal, state, local, and university requirements for conducting research with those human participants. So the Human Research Protection Program is the umbrella within which the IRB sits alongside USU employees and students. The Human Research Protection Program is comprised of the following primary components. USU offices and personnel who share the goal of promoting infrastructures for research at USU that prioritize the protection of human research participants in all work. The IRB, and most importantly, the researchers who themselves conceive of and implement those protections in their work directly with living people, the information of those living people, and their specimens. So at USU, the Human Research Protection infrastructure overseen by the Vice President for Research, Lee Burrow, and is largely implemented by the Human Research Protections Office led by Nicole Vouvalis. The slide is the slide is sticky for some reason. So in order to accept any federal funding for research, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, I just wanted to make sure it had moved for you.
Yeah, it was slow. I don't know why. Okay. So in order to accept any federal funding for research with human participants, Utah State is required to establish review standards for all of its research with human participants. Utah State University applies the Belmont Report principles to the entirety of its portfolio, funded or not. The Belmont Report provides overarching ethical guidelines for the use of human participants in research, and that includes respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. Every review the IRB conducts at USU must ensure the presence of those principles. The Common Rule contains requirements for the composition of IRBs, minimum criteria for approval of any human subjects research protocol, standards for informed consent, and other important tenets of IRB processes and requirements. 45 CFR 46 also has a subpart for 3 distinct populations it considers to be vulnerable. And those are pregnant persons, prisoners, or those involved in the justice system, children, and children, those three populations. So in practice, USU applies the Common Rule requirements to most aspects of research as well. So yeah, now I will turn it over to Nicole, who will get us started on the details of the review process.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to start actually functionally with our pre-review process, because that is a space where a lot of people get hung up in terms of seeking IRB review. And so even though we're talking about regulatory mastery in this series, I thought that this could be an important component for folks to understand in terms of why a protocol might not get started right away. So we'll start with the pre-review phase. every protocol that comes in the door is examined for completion, structural congruity, and baseline compliance needs. So we're going to begin today's discussion talking about some of the most common ways in which protocols can be delayed. We also will be posting our pre-review checklist to our training website where these slides live. So we're not trying to hide the ball. It's not supposed to be a mystery. And investigators can use that checklist to determine whether their protocol is ready for review before they even submit it to us. So starting here, personnel issues are far and away the most common reason a protocol gets returned to research teams. So here I have a sample personnel with me and one of my amazing staff members. And here we identify an issue that would be a problem during the pre-review process. I do not have the conduct of research in my role statement. However, a principal investigator must be a person at the institution with research in their role statement or an individual authorized by their home department to oversee human subjects research. The idea behind this is that it does take some amount of university resources to properly and safely conduct research that involves human participants. And we assume by default that if research is in your role statement, you have access to those resources, you have space and time carved out in your role statement to pay very close attention to those things as they are progressing. And essentially everything that you might need would be encompassed in your role. If that's not the case, then we do need to check with your home department to ensure that you are authorized to have access to those resources, to spend time in those things. I have unfortunately had occasion to have department heads say, no, actually, we employ this person for a certain amount of time, and we want 100% of that time to be dedicated to research. So it's actually not appropriate for them to be conducting human subjects research within the context of their role statement. And that's one of the reasons why we check in, is to make sure that like one part of the university is not authorizing work that the primary part of the university who could do that wouldn't want to see done, and which could become a problem for participants if halfway through a study, a person is no longer available to them or the resource no longer exists. And that could be an issue for their safety or well-being, or even just the confidentiality of their data. So I do not have research in my role statement. I'm on a purely sort of administrative role statement, and so I should not be serving as a PI. That would be identified during the pre-review process, and this protocol would be returned so that we could identify an appropriate PI, or I could go seek that authorization from my home department. Another issue that is fairly common in the pre-review phase is lack of training by a member of the research team. Any personnel without city training can hold up the review process. We cannot accept a protocol where the listed personnel do not have city training. If they are not on our lookup list, which you can access right there in that sort of personnel table, well, just above the personnel table, that means we don't have access to their city training. It doesn't mean they don't have city training. It is possible, for example, that they completed city training under a different name than the name that is currently listed for them in Banner. It is possible that they completed city training at another institution and they haven't affiliated with Utah State University in the city system, such that we would be able to go and find their training records. So there are a number of things that could be going on there, but we try very hard to find a training for that person if we can. So using A numbers to look up in the city database system in case it's a name change, looking for previous records or previous protocols where there might be that person listed and it's just a certificate that's uploaded rather than us actually receiving the training information. But if we do our best and we cannot find it, then we will return the protocol to you and ask that the PI help us to track down city training for the personnel who are listed on their protocol. And so I see a question about this that I think I can go ahead and answer now pretty neatly. So we'll go ahead and do that. Can a graduate research assistant who is working on a dissertation be a PI? The answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that the institution is assuming that you are still in training as a graduate research assistant. And so you are by default not authorized to oversee human subjects research by Utah State University. But that doesn't mean that you can't lead the protocol's creation, participate very heavily in their procedures, but the oversight of the project and the responsibility for the careful conduct of that project does still rest with your advisor, who is responsible in their role as an advisor for fully completing your training. And so the follow-up question there was, do you list your dissertation committee chair as your PI? Yes, you will. You will list your advisor, your chair, whatever your department sort of parlance for that is, as your principal investigator when you're submitting a human subjects research protocol. So moving on to other issues at the pre-review phase. Informed consent documentation is the second most frequent source of protocols being turned back to the research team before the review can begin. So there are a few requirements, all of which are communicated here, but there's a lot of text and it's easy to overlook. So we'll go over some of these requirements briefly here. The first is that the document be provided in Word. And this is so that we can do a couple of things. We need to be able to apply our approval stamp, but we also need to be able to meaningfully track changes that would occur to that document throughout the life cycle of the protocol. And so providing it in Word gives us an opportunity to use track changes to ensure that over time, as your protocol morphs and shifts and things change, the realities on the ground contend with your well-laid plans, that we understand how those things have changed. And I won't go over it here because it doesn't impact you so much, but I'd say about a third of the 22 pages of regulations that we're going to be talking about today have to do with the records that IRBs are charged with keeping. And so while it may not appear that way on the surface, we do have to sort of be able to produce documentation about the entire life cycle of a protocol. Should an auditor come knocking or a sponsor of an externally funded research project's sponsor or USU internal audit or the state auditor, we need to document that. We need to show that we have documented every stage of that protocol along its life cycle. So that is one of the reasons we request informed consent documents in Word. It helps us meet our documentation requirements. The second most common reason that protocols are returned to the research team having to do with informed consent documentation is having to do with the templates. So you never have to use the USU IRB's template. We do not require this of you. We have created that so that it can be a helpful aid for you. And so if you choose not to use it, as long as you are providing that document in Word, then you're good to go. You would pass the pre-review process. Now, we don't recommend doing that because there are a lot of requirements that are they're varied. They come from all kinds of different places. And so we've designed our templates to be helpful there, but you are more than welcome to not use one of our templates. If you are going to use one of our templates, you must use the most up-to-date version. This, for example, has our old Office of Research logo on it, which is one of just the visual aids that we use to keep track of those. But we have versions that are listed on our website in the templates that we have. And so we do request that when we update those versions, you are using the most recent versions. The biggest reason for that is that we only update versions not for stylistic reasons or anything like that, but because there has been guidance from one of our federal agencies that says that something about this process has changed. And so when we make those updates, we need folks to rely on our expertise in its most up-to-date form. So if you're going to use one of our templates, we do require that you use the most recent version. We really try not to change these very often. It really is a matter of agency guidance being updated or agency requirements being updated. And that is not happening much right now. I expect not much out of the next 4 years. So we probably are set for one more update within the next calendar year, 2025. And then I expect we would be leaving those templates be for a year or two, maybe even 3. I do want to note one other thing here that's not a pre-review issue. You would pass if you did this thing, but we really strongly recommend starting from scratch every time you're going to use a template. I know that it's easier to take an old and approved document and just make some edits to it, but if something, our template is very long and we say, you can remove this section if, you can remove this section if, you can remove this section if. And so you wouldn't know whether that section should be included if you're working based off of an old one because you had already removed it. One really great example of this is, let's say you have a pilot project, and along the way, you receive federal funding for your project. And you make some changes. It's a big enough change that you're going to file a new protocol, but you want to use the same consent form. Once your protocol becomes federally funded, there are a number of new requirements that attach to that protocol that we would not enforce on a protocol that is not federally funded. One of those requirements is something called a key information section. So if your protocol is federally funded and your consent form is going to be more than 3 pages in length, you are required to include that key information section. But if you had a pilot study of an informed consent document that was more than 3 pages in length, you would have deleted that key information section because you wouldn't have needed it. It added more information than you needed, and so it came out. And then at the review stage, we would have to have you put that back in, and it ends up repeating some other information that you would have designed along the way. So really the cleanest way to do that, the best way to communicate clear information to your participants would be to start from scratch in a new informed consent template. Again, recommendation, not a requirement. We do find that while it is a little more work up front, it is considerably less frustrating than getting a bunch of review comments on your informed consent document down the road. So just a plug there for a best practice, but not necessarily something tied to the pre-review process. Here are some other items that require a protocol to be turned back at the pre-review phase. So if there is external funding on the project, the principal investigator for the funding must match the principal investigator for the protocol. If the principal investigator has an expired protocol that was not renewed or closed in a timely manner, we will not accept a new protocol from that person until they either close that protocol out properly or they replace it with a new protocol, depending on the stage of work that the project was in. If a student thesis or dissertation is marked, but no evidence of committee approval or even committee agreement is provided, that would send the protocol back. A non-USU researcher working on this project would need to provide evidence of their city training. We can't look up people from other institutions. And so if we don't have that, we would turn the protocol back to you to provide that information. And then lastly, another researcher has initialed the conflicts and assurances section, but those conflicts and assurances are for the principal investigator. And this happens a lot when somebody else starts a protocol. They just kind of work through it, and apply their initials. But we really do need the principal investigator to be signing off on those assurances and reviewing the information regarding conflict of interest. So those are, again, some of the most common ways that a protocol doesn't make it through the pre-review process. And that means the clock on your review has not started for us. Our accrediting body tells us that we should count the number of days it takes to approve a protocol based on when we received a fully complete and able to be reviewed protocol. And so our clock doesn't start until we receive these things and have all of these items in order. So again, we'll be posting that pre-review checklist to our website once the transcription and recording of this training are also posted. And you are more than welcome to use that checklist to work through your protocols and see if they're ready for actual substantive review on your own. Or we are more than happy to continue doing the pre-review process. It's part of what we do, and it's no sweat off our backs. Moving on to the substantive review process. Essentially, what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the entire protocol template in Kuali, and I'm going to tell you the kinds of things that from a regulatory perspective, we're looking for on each of these pages. Now, I'm not going into every single ethical concern. This is our regulatory training mastery series, but I am going to walk through how to ensure that you are meeting the regulatory requirements that are set out for us in a protocol review process. So this is a screenshot of our basic information section, our first section in Kuali protocols. And we're going to go through just a couple of regulatory considerations that we're starting with right off the bat when you fill out this part. One of the things that we are required to check for is an external funding source. And I mentioned earlier that, for example, your informed consent requirements are different depending on the status of funding. There are also all kinds of different rules about data storage and data collection and single IRB review versus having collaborators across several institutions review something, and a ton of requirements that really do turn on the funding structure of the protocol. So when we're asking whether the research is externally funded, it's really critical that that be answered accurately and that it be kept up to date. So if you receive funding for a project that you are going to carry out regardless, and that funding comes through, an amendment to update that funding status would be appropriate because we do need to make sure that the protocol is comporting with sponsor requirements as the sponsor has communicated those. So that's the first thing that we are looking for on this page from a regulatory perspective. And then we're also looking for the review type. And we have a variety of review types available. We allow PIs to identify their own review type if they wish, or you can make that last selection there, which is that you are uncertain and you'd like the IRB to categorize appropriately, and we will. And just so you know what happens when you make that selection, we will always first review the protocol to see if it can be categorized as exempt. If you can proceed under a sort of lower level of review, we want to help you to do that. So we always start there. And in case you have not had a lot of exposure to those, here's just a brief summary of the exemption categories and what that sort of means. So exempt doesn't mean no review, it means the lowest level of review. And what it means is that it's exempt from many of the requirements I'm going to go over today. A lot of the requirements I'm going to be talking with you about come from 45 CFR 46, Section 111, and then sections 116 and 117. And so we do not have to document compliance with each and every one of those sections when a protocol is considered to fall within the categories of exemption. And so there's a brief list. I have the URL available there so that you can review those on your own, and they're drop-down menus. So if any of those particular exemption categories interest you, you can visit that website, use the drop-down to learn more information about where the requirements might be for you to fall within one of those categories of exemption. But again, if you select I'm uncertain, we are going to assess it for an exemption very quickly either way. However, I will say, if you know that your project is exempt, your protocol is going to be much shorter. And so if you feel quite certain that your project is exempt, I would not recommend that you say you're uncertain and you want the IRB to categorize, just because you'd be creating more work for yourself. The exempt protocol is considerably shorter, has fewer fields, and so you could save yourself some time if you're feeling pretty sure there. So let's move on to our next section in the protocol, which is study personnel. Here, we also have two primary regulatory considerations that we are looking at. We're looking for external researcher agreements where you have a non-USU researcher working on the project. I mentioned single IRB earlier when it ties to funding, and this is one of those pieces where if you're externally funded and your protocol is not exempt, single IRB is a requirement. It is not an option. And so if you're collaborating across two or more institutions, and your project is federally funded, then it is a requirement that our IRBs collaborate on the review process and identify one single IRB that will be the site of review. That requirement does not hold if the project is exempt, but if it is expedited or full board, this is a requirement, and so it is something that we are screening for. The other thing is appropriate training, and the regulations and our accrediting body require that we ensure that researchers or anybody who meets the definition of an investigator has appropriate training before they interact with research participants identifiable information, or their identifiable biospecimens. And so that's another piece of what we are screening for on this page. That big sort of middle section there is designed to help you to determine whether your non-USU colleagues are actually investigators. So for example, as we note there, actually as we note in the personnel fields when you open them, somebody who's only helping to analyze data that have been completely de-identified before they're handed over to them, that person would not be engaged such to require a reliance agreement. And so here, like, we have this list of tasks where if the non-USU investigator is doing that thing, we should be then reaching out to the other IRBs to ask for reliance agreements. So those are two of the regulatory requirements that we are looking for in that study personnel section. Moving on next to our project overview section. This is the first time that the scientific reviewer assigned to your protocol gets to learn about your research questions, your study design, and the purpose of the study. Each of these considerations are relevant to the IRB's need to both find and document a criteria for approval. They also become important later when we're assessing the informed consent process and the informed consent documentation. But here, primarily, we are looking at that 111 criteria of ensuring that risks to subjects are minimized by using procedures that are consistent with sound research design. To understand whether the research design is sound, we do have to understand the research questions or the hypotheses or the investigation or the nature of the exploration of the study. And we need to have a thorough overview of your of the procedures of the entire study, not just what the participants will be asked to do, but information about how you as a researcher are going to make good use of the information that you glean from your participants. An insufficient proposal can really inhibit our IRB members' review of the project. And so I want to show you some of the questions that IRB members are required to answer before they can move forward with recommending approval for a particular protocol. So here is some of what we are needing to look at to both make a finding of and document the finding of sound scientific design of a project. I know a lot of folks think that there's no place for study design critique by the IRB. The regulations simply state that that is not the case. We do have to find and document sound research design, and if we cannot make that finding, then we are charged with either making recommendations that would allow us to make that finding if those changes are implemented, or bringing it to the board for discussion and perhaps disapproval. Now, in my, oh gosh, I don't know, 10 years of being on the IRB and being in this office, I don't know that we've ever turned away a protocol for research design issues. It's always been either a really serious regulatory issue or a sort of just a bunch of mismatches or that the risks outweigh the benefits. But in terms of just like course study design, we're always going to make a recommendation, and that's we want to work with researchers toward an approval. We're not interested in turning down research proposals, again, unless it would be very risky and non-beneficial to a research participant. So moving on to the substance of the review process. Again, we're actually staying within the project overview section. There's a lot of stuff that we're looking at here. We do request a proposal in this section, and that is for any project that is expedited, convened IRB, for a thesis or a dissertation, or funded. And we're primarily looking actually here at funding and thesis and dissertation matchup. And we do that because Section 103D of the Common Rule requires us to certify that the project that we have under review is indeed the project that the agency has agreed to fund. And so in order to accomplish that certification, we do need to review those things for congruency. So we have access to the sponsored programs side of Kowali, and we can see what is in there. And that's why we require you to provide your proposal, is so that we can make sure that those things are substantially matching. They don't need to be one for one. And in fact, we understand that often one funding mechanism might have 2, 3, I think we have one with 7 different protocols associated with it. So it's not to say you have to do your entire funding project within one single protocol. But we are looking for that congruence so that we can certify as an institution back to the agency that we have done that which it has charged us with doing in the Common Rule. We are also looking for jurisdictional components there. So at the very bottom of your screen is a cutoff sort of specify each country, territory, or distinct cultural location where the research will take place. And that is because we are required to make assessments about the protections that are expected in that location, the Common Rule protections that are required, and the Belmont principles. And we're kind of supposed to look at all 3 of those spaces, find the area of overlap, and kind of apply the highest level of protections across the 3. And so if, for example, you're collecting data in the European Union, there's a data protection law called the General Data Protection Regulation that requires signed informed consent from participants if you're collecting certain types of information. And so, where we would be assessing your meeting the requirements of the GDPR, if you're collecting data in the EU, um, that means we sort of don't have to assess as strongly your process for getting signatures, for example, because you've already comported with the GDPR requirements. The 45 CFR 46 requirements on signatures for consent forms become sort of easier to assess. So we have to sort of weigh and hold all three of those, sort of sometimes more than three, depending on the location where the research is occurring, and make sure that we're sort of applying the highest standard across those three or more. So that's another part of what we are assessing in this project overview section from a regulatory standpoint. Moving on to the study participant section. At the very top of this section, we have the definition of a study participant, or a human subject, as the regulations say. I don't know, something just feels icky about subject to me, so I say it when I'm quoting regulations, but I often refer to human subjects as research participants. So when you're assessing what should be included in this section here, you should use the definitions provided here. And they're not always they're not always super obvious. So for example, here, identifiable private information or specimens. So you could have a human subject even if you're never going to talk to a person, even if you're never going to put a data collection instrument online. If you're working with secondary data and that data are identifiable and they are about a living person, then it could be a human subject. And so that's why we provide that definition. We encourage you to reach out to us if you need help with that distinction. But when we're in this section, these are the sort of four primary things that we are looking for. Is selection of subjects equitable? Do we have, or can we assess accurately whether the subjects are already undergoing procedures for a diagnostic or a treatment purpose, perhaps, which might address the research questions? And so we're looking at the description of your research participants because we want to see whether there might be something those folks are already doing that you could use to answer your research questions rather than asking them to, for example, repeat a procedure, which maybe they've already done. We also have to have particular cognizance with regard to subjects who are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. The regulations don't quite say what that means, but I sort of interpret it as working in concert with that next provision that I've identified there, that there are additional safeguards for participants who are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. And I see that I have a typo there. I apologize. It is supposed to be undue influence. And so that is one of the pieces that we're looking for. Just below this part of the screenshot is a question about vulnerable populations in that same section. And those vulnerable populations are the same ones that are identified in longer text quotes from the regulations here. And it's children, it's people who are in a differential power relationship, it's people who are economically or educationally disadvantaged. And so those are the sorts of factors that we are supposed to take into account when we are reviewing a protocol. And so if we cannot find and document that there have been additional safeguards for a population that is described as vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, then we cannot give final approval to a protocol. So that's a little bit of what we're looking at. I also created in this example something that we're constantly looking for, which is consistency. So this table portion here exists because often people are conducting research that have several different populations. In a school-based project, for example, you might have administrators as one population, parents as one population, children as one population, and teachers as one population. And so we are looking here. I know it seems repetitive, like, why are you asking me twice? Well, these numbers could be very different depending on the number of participants in each sort of participant category that you're looking at. And then we want to see how many you think will complete the study versus how many you think will begin the study. And we're looking for realistic rates of attrition here. Not everybody approached about a study is going to agree to participate. And so that's one thing that we're looking for. And we're also looking for potential, this is again, not a regulatory thing, but I'll just toss it in since we're looking at this page. We're also looking at potential ethical issues. If 100 people are going to begin the study and only 20 are going to finish, why might that be? That's a pretty high rate of attrition. Is it because the study procedures are particularly taxing? In which case, we might say, you might consider offering compensation to your research participants. Because if you need 75 people in order to accomplish your aims, and you anticipate only 20, there should be something that you consider to help people stay engaged and to feel like it's worth their time and effort. Um, or there might be another ethical consideration underlying that, depending on the procedures and the item that you're studying, or there might be no concern at all. If your study is longitudinal, for example, you're going to follow the same cohort of people over 5 years, we expect a high rate of attrition. A lot of folks drop out in studies that last a long period of time. And so starting with 100 and ending with 20 actually wouldn't be that far outside of the realm of what's normal for a study that is designed in that way. So that's why we ask some of the questions that we ask and why something might look repetitive, but actually we really are looking at those different and distinct populations to help make sure that you can address the aims that you've set out in the study. And then the last thing that we're looking for, it's not in this particular screenshot, but in that same table where you're identifying a population, we ask you whether you're going to engage in any screening to determine eligibility or to make, sort of, we don't want people to participate in this who have this condition because it might not be safe for them. And so the regulations say that screening before informed consent can occur if it's for the purpose of screening, recruiting, determining eligibility. So one of the things that we're doing here by putting our screener question right next to the eligibility question is helping you to make sure that your eligibility criteria match your screening questions. And so if you're asking for more information in your screener than is outlined in your inclusion or exclusion criteria, that's going to raise a question from us. It's not that you cannot do it. If you do it, you need an alteration of informed consent. And we are going to talk a lot more about that in March. So come back to the March training if you're interested in that particular piece. But that is also one of the things that we're assessing, compliance with this portion of the common rule that says you can obtain information before informed consent, but it must be limited to that which is required for the purpose of screening, recruiting, or determining eligibility. Here we move on to the study procedures portion. There are a number of separate determinations that IRB members are making with regard to study procedures. And so we'll go on the next slide and see some of the questions that they're asking. But here are some of the regulatory requirements that are outlined directly in 45 CFR 46 that identify procedures specifically. The important part here, the IRB member has to have a comprehensive understanding of the procedures that will be utilized within the study. If they don't have that comprehensive understanding, they cannot make the finding and then document the finding regarding the approval criteria. So they're looking to see that the procedures are consistent with sound research design. They're looking to see that we're utilizing procedures that are already being performed, if that's at all possible. We are making sure that your informed consent document communicates very clearly about the procedures that the participants will need to follow, and that alternative procedures that might be advantageous to the subject are contemplated. So unless we know the procedures you're using, it would be very difficult to correctly identify any alternative procedures that might be relevant to the participants. And then if we don't know all of the procedures, we cannot assess the risks associated with each of those procedures. And so we need to be able to, in our informed consent documentation, ensure that the risks associated with any given procedure are being communicated within that informed consent document. Here is a subset of the questions. It would take sort of 4 slides to go through all of the questions. But here are some of the questions that our IRB members are asked to answer so that we can document those findings that I went over on the last screen. And so things like, even though we're talking here about inclusion and exclusion criteria, that becomes important because of the procedure. If, for example, you're using a procedure that utilizes radiation, we need to know what the procedure is in order to know what a contraindication for radiation exposure might be. And so until we know the procedures, we don't know what the appropriate inclusion and exclusion criteria for a participant to safeguard their well-being might be. One thing that my IRB chair, who could not be here today, wanted me to make sure to identify is that those last two bulleted questions in the third column, the importance of research questions aligning with your methods and analysis. So making sure that your research questions and your data collection, sorry, that your questionnaires and your data collection sheets are aligned with the analyses identified in your proposal and that they do not go beyond that which are identified and appropriate for your research questions. Human participants are not an appropriate place to go on fishing expeditions. The Belmont principles do require that we make sure that we're not asking more of people than we need to accomplish the scientific aims we have. So inherent in that, our IRB members are assessing the appropriateness of questionnaires and methods for research participants. And another thing we're doing is looking at the potential repetitiveness of those things. And so we might, we've seen screening packets that are 12 pages long, but a lot of them are screening for similar things, or they're screening for things that people in a clinical setting have already been screened for. And so those are the sorts of things that a member would point out in their review as needing revision. I would say, though, that the biggest, from my perspective, one of the biggest things that really trip people up is this one here, having all of the relevant data collection and intervention materials. We know that it can be difficult to provide like the entirety of, in particular, an intervention before you have approval to conduct the work, but we do at least need a pretty specific outline. Again, we don't know what alternative procedures are available if we don't know what the procedures that you're undergoing are. And alternative procedures are one of those things that we are required to communicate to research participants before they enroll in a study. And missing items might lead us to question, how can you address this portion of your research question when you haven't collected X, Y, or Z? So that's, again, a small subset of the procedure-related items that have to do with, the study procedures section of the protocol and how those tie into regulatory determinations that IRB members are required to make. Moving on to risks and benefits. The next section in our protocol has to do with, again, risks and benefits. And the IRB must find and, again, document that the benefits to the research outweigh the risks of the research. That does not mean that the benefits to participants must outweigh the risks to participants. So it is not terribly uncommon for research participants to face a greater than minimal risk protocol procedure, even though the benefits are indirect. And so the benefits might be to society, to science, and not necessarily directly to the research participant. And so that's something to factor in when you are looking at putting your protocol together, is that the IRB must find that the benefits of the research outweigh the risks to participants. And so it's not always a direct one-to-one comparison, and we do see the value of benefits that are indirect. And so that's not a reason your protocol would necessarily get turned away or face a hard time, although we are required to also make sure that risks are minimized. You saw that language on a couple of slides so far. Risks are minimized by, and then discrete items within that list. But that is one of the things that we are also looking for. So yes, it is okay to have a greater than minimal risk protocol, but we are charged with ensuring that those risks are minimized to the extent possible while still accomplishing the scientific aims of the study. So here we're also asking about benefits. And so that's a space where, honestly, I would say a lot of people sell themselves short in my experience. I think researchers tend to talk about the benefits to science or to society, but not as much about the benefits of benefits directly to research participants. And so, I mean, we don't want you to stretch those, but do definitely consider from your research participants' perspective what the benefits of participation might look like for them. And one thing I want to note here, benefits are not the same as compensation. Compensation is remuneration that you are giving to a participant in exchange for their time and effort engaging in your study. A benefit is a research-related benefit that they draw by the virtue of enrolling in your study. And so it is distinct from compensation. So if you are providing a procedure to someone free of charge, that would be akin to compensation. But if a participant might experience some alleviation of their anxiety, it's a potential benefit. And that's something that you should say. If you're exploring whether it does that thing, you shouldn't promise that it will do that thing, but it might do that thing. And or if it's if you're looking at extending a therapeutic intervention to a new population, it's fair to say that in other populations, it has been documented that those populations have benefited in this way. And we want to see, we're looking to learn more about the extent to which that would be true within this different sort of cultural context or among this differently situated group of folks. And so again, don't sell yourself short on the benefits. It's something I tend to see a lot. Likewise, do not undersell your risks. I want to take a moment to talk about the importance of identifying your risks properly and in advance. So, identifying them thoroughly and comprehensively upfront is really important. One of the key tenets of informed consent is that people are presented with all of the information that a reasonable person would want to know before deciding whether to enroll in a study. And if you know that there is a risk of stomach discomfort associated with taking a supplement that you're studying, you should not assume that a layperson would know that taking a new supplement that they've never taken before could upset their tummies. That is something a reasonable person would want to know. And if you know that there's a high likelihood of that happening, disclosing it up front, letting participants have that information and make an informed choice, A, obviously respects the whole informed consent process and the purpose behind it and why it is required, but B, will save you a lot of heartache on the back end if that risk does materialize. In the example I gave you, I think one thing that we hear is like, yeah, eating anything new has the potential to upset somebody's stomach. Well, it should be in the consent form because if it's not in the consent form, it needs to be reported if it happens after approval. And that reporting process, we won't delve too much into it here. Our April training is on unanticipated adverse events and other post-approval requirements. But I will say it is much easier to document a risk in advance than it is to work through the unanticipated adverse event process. Because if an event happens to a participant that is tied to a risk, the protocol needs to be completely re-reviewed and completely re-reviewed by the full board. And so if you, for example, worked through a lower level of review that did not require the full board's review, and an unanticipated adverse event crops up, that study will then be placed on an agenda for the full IRB to review, and it is treated as a new review. And so you could have a possibility where you're stopping midway through your study while the IRB makes additional requirements tied to these new risks. And of course, if you knew that a risk was present and you didn't disclose it, then the IRB will have to look very closely at that project to see if there are other risks that potentially weren't disclosed or considered. And so please, 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 please identify your foreseeable risks. Again, it is the Belmont principle of respect for persons that really weighs heavily here. And if that doesn't catch your attention, not having to work through the unanticipated adverse event process on the back end is something that also I think we are all aligned on wanting to avoid. So that is a bit about risks and benefits. And here I have just some determinations about risks and benefits that IRB members are required to find and document before they can recommend a protocol for approval. One of the things here that I'll note is the first question that they're asked about risks is what is the level of risk associated with this protocol? Minimal risk is defined as the probability and magnitude of harm not be greater than that of everyday procedures or routine clinical interventions. And we see a lot of people going way out of their way to avoid a greater than minimal risk determination. The only thing a greater than minimal risk project gets you with adults uh, is a data and safety monitoring plan and probably convened IRB review. But if you're in a space where your protocol is greater than minimal risk anyway, your procedures are probably going to bring you into convened IRB review and not necessarily just your risk level. So really, having a data and safety monitoring plan is like functionally one of the only additional requirements for um, a greater than minimal risk designation. We do not view greater than minimal risk as bad. It is not something to be frowned upon or avoided. It does need to be justified by the benefits of the study, but greater than minimal risk is not that uncommon. And so please don't tie yourself up in knots trying to avoid that determination. It really is not much more work on the study team's end, and it communicates something meaningful and important to research participants when you're accurately characterizing those risks. So that's something just about that first piece there. And while we do ask you, and we say this in the protocol, we ask you to identify a probable risk level. The risk level is up to the IRB in terms of what it decides is appropriate for that particular protocol. And so where we are making a greater than minimal risk determination, the board would be making that. It wouldn't rest with one or two people. And so you can rest assured that trained researchers, probably representing your department's expertise area, are actually the ones making those determinations. There are some other questions in here that tie to confidentiality that we'll talk about a little bit more in the next section on confidentiality, but it's the risk of the confidentiality breach is the piece that we are required to assess. And so you'll see that some of these concepts are overlapping and call on reviewers to look at lots of different parts of the protocol in order to make a determination in one particular section. Okay, confidentiality. I want to start here with a brief discussion of the difference between privacy and confidentiality, because those are two concepts that are often conflated, but they are distinct and importantly so. Privacy is the extent to which participants have control over the timing, setting, and sharing that occurs in a research setting. Confidentiality is the extent to which you will protect information about the participants. So let's talk about an example as a way to sort of further specify these distinct concepts. One good illustration here can be articulated in a recruitment process. So let's say a researcher wants to use medical records to recruit patients who they know would meet the inclusion criteria for their study. So they're targeting people with a particular health condition or who have sought treatment for a particular health condition. And so they know that these folks would be eligible. And it makes it very simple to recruit. And recruitment is, as I'm sure many of you know, can be pretty tough. And so to the extent that process can be simplified, it helps to ensure that the benefits that you're seeking to realize in your study are more easily achieved. The privacy concerns in this setting would be the extent to which the patient has control over their health records and their health information being shared. So a patient has, or a client, depending on the setting, has medical records on file, but for the purpose of seeking medical treatment from their care provider. A notice of privacy practice might say that they might share their information, but not that many of them say, we're going to share your health information with researchers. And even the ones that do, I think I know like 4 people who actually read the notice of privacy practices at their care provider before they just sign it so that they can go on into their appointment. It's one of these things like, you know, you download a new app in the App Store and it's like, yeah, I agree to the terms and conditions, man. Just let me like post my pictures. It's sort of the same thing. It's called a contract of adhesion. Like I can't move forward and do the thing I'm seeking to do until I sign your paper or agree to your terms. And so I'm going to agree to your terms. And this is not a conversation. I don't get to negotiate with you. I have to agree or not. And notices of privacy practice are kind of that thing, right? I have to agree or not. I can always retract it later, but like we don't get to sit down and say, I'm good with this sharing and I'm not good with this sharing. So those are privacy concerns, right? Um, how, how much control do I have over my medical records being shared? That's my medical privacy, those records that we're discussing when we're talking about sharing those records with a researcher for the purpose of recruitment. So that's what we're assessing in a recruitment process. We are looking at the extent to which it comports with a reasonable person's expectations around privacy and whether a reasonable person might view that kind of sharing as a privacy violation. Confidentiality kicks in once the researcher has those records. It's how are you going to store them? Who's going to have access to that storage space? Will they be de-identified? Are you going to anonymize them? How are they being transferred? Is it a direct upload into a box file that has a PHI shield attached? Or is it going to be emailed? Is the email account that you're going to be using protected by dual or multi-factor authentication? Or is it a personal email account? If it's a personal email account, every time you open Safari, do you get that little notice that says, hey, some of your passwords have been found on the web? And if so, are you using some of those passwords with the email account that's going to receive the PHI? Are you going to be securely deleting those records once you're done using them? Those are confidentiality concerns. So privacy and confidentiality are closely related concepts. But because privacy has more to do with how the study will be carried out with participants or their identifiable information, we actually don't ask about privacy in this confidentiality section. We have privacy questions in the study participant section when we're asking about your recruitment process, and in the procedures section that ask to what extent will participants have control over privacy concerns while they are engaging in your study. So here we are talking almost exclusively about information about research participants and not like how they're going to engage with you. And so that's a really nice sort of clean way to think about privacy versus confidentiality and what you should be addressing when you're within this section. So here are some of the pieces that we are asked to assess by the Common Rule in considerations regarding confidentiality. So I have the little target there because confidentiality is one of those spaces in the protocol where it can be a bit of a moving target. It is left to the IRB to determine the confidentiality protections that are appropriate for the type of data collected and the type of study that it is. So if we looked back to those other questions that I shared with you previously regarding risks to employability or reputation or stigmatization, we're actually looking at two things there. We're looking at risks of disclosure and risks related to your confidentiality setup. So the regulations say to us, like, basically pretend this information is not going to be kept confidential. If the information participants have shared were breached, were disclosed, would it impact their employability, their reputation, their insurability, their standing in their community, etc.? And so in a weird way, we are looking at confidentiality as if there's going to be a breach, which we've been doing since I started working here a decade ago. And at the time, I thought it didn't make much sense. But now, I mean, every month in my email, I'm like, you stayed at a hotel in Vegas once, and so now your data has been breached, or your healthcare provider has experienced a hack, or insurance provider, and there's been a breach, there's been a breach, there's been a breach. And so now I'm more convinced that this actually is the appropriate way to think about participant data. If it is breached, to what extent might it harm participants? That's the consideration that the IRB is looking at when it's looking at confidentiality protections that should be in place for your data. And so I say that it's kind of a moving target because really the sensitiveness of the sensitivity, not sensitiveness, of the information that you collect is what drives the IRB's sort of placing a point on the spectrum of the extent to which you need to keep information confidential. So there's no hard and fast rule. One example of this, of a sort of IRB myth I don't think I'll ever stop hearing, is like, you've got to delete data within 3 years. Um, I've never seen anything like that in any kind of IRB regulation or guidance or anything else that we are required to adhere to. But it's something that we see a lot. And I'd venture to say that it actually causes more trouble than it helps. One reason for that is that folks sort of write, we're going to delete everything within 3 years because they think it's what the IRB wants to hear. And then 3.5 years passes and that information hasn't been deleted because you're still using it. That's way worse in our minds if you told it to participants than if you had said, I'm going to keep it for 5 years. And that, being the normal time frame within which a PhD student is working to complete their dissertation, we would much rather you just give yourself plenty of time in terms of like time frame for deletion if you're not working with highly sensitive data. If you're working with highly sensitive data, we might be more likely to impose a much faster de-identification and ultimate deletion process. Now, I say all of that factoring in that I also understand that the open science movement is very important and that a lot of federal funding carries requirements related to posting data, making information available so that that study can be replicated and so that we don't keep running into the file drawer problem of, we didn't find what we anticipated and so no journal is going to publish this. Well, that doesn't mean it's not useful information. And so IRB members are sort of walking this really delicate tightrope of what is the appropriate balance of confidentiality and privacy and managing this information, but also creating the most benefits that we can out of this work that's been done. So I wish I could give you a if you say this in your confidentiality section, you're going to be a-okay answer, but it's one of the places where it's actually really far from the case. This really is always going to be a situational assessment on the IRB members' part, in concert with, of course, how we've handled things historically, any new regulations that might be impacted or that might impact your work. For example, not that it's new, but HIPAA requires that if you're going to create a medical record in your research, that be maintained for at least 7 years. That's a very long time frame. And so we wouldn't be looking for something like a 3-year deletion time frame or a 2-year deletion time frame if that was the kind of work that you were doing. So here, I think the key is reasonable and appropriate protections for the work that you're doing. And I think as long as you can point to why those are reasonable and appropriate, that's a conversation that can be had amongst the IRB members and the study team reviewing the project. I do want to step back to something I mentioned, which is to say, don't be too conservative, especially in your timeframes for de-identification and deletion. One of the most common reportable events that we receive is one surrounding, I told participants I would delete their data in 2 years, and now it's been 4 and I still haven't deleted it. If you've made that kind of commitment and you cannot reach out and get consent from them again, we probably would make you delete the data at that time, and we really don't want to do that. So give yourself plenty of time. Do not be too restrictive on the amount of time you need, while again, sort of balancing the considerations of the sensitivity of holding on to that information. We are not going to visit in depth about the informed consent section. That's because our next training is entirely on informed consent. I could hold a whole semester's worth of trainings on informed consent, and I might, if none of you suggest topics, I might do that for the fall. But since we're going to visit about that in such depth, I will say one of the most important things to be aware of here is, well, 2 most important things I think that lead to a lot of review comments and sort of holding up your approval process is consistency. So if you make a change in your protocol, you need to make sure that that change is reflected in your informed consent document as well. And ease of understanding. Our templates are written for the most common population that we see, college-educated adults. If you are not working with college-educated adults, we expect that you will make significant changes to our informed consent templates. We don't want you using that kind of language with a population for whom it is not appropriate. Similarly, you cannot, I could also do a whole training or a whole semester on equitable selection of subjects, but you cannot exclude participants simply because they do not speak English. And so this readability and understandability piece is not just about the population that you're working with and how that gets communicated in English, but also about the importance of making sure that your study is accessible to the class of people who might benefit from your research. Now, if you're targeting USU students for participation, there is a minimum English speaking requirement to be admitted to Utah State University, and we won't have to ask you questions about that. If you are working in West Valley schools, we will expect that you have learned information from the schools about the languages that are used at home for those participant populations, and that you have lowered the barriers to entry for your study to the extent that you can. And I will say one thing that's really important in this distinction, and again, I could hold a whole training on this. One thing that's really important in that distinction is, does your research have direct benefits to participants? If so, exclusion on the basis of language cannot be permitted without a really strong scientific justification for doing so. And so thinking about those two principles, consistency and ease of accessing the information that you contain in your informed consent document, I would say would get you most of the way to getting a pretty clean approval process when it comes to informed consent. The other thing I'll say is that if you have an in-person research component, and particularly if you have a somewhat invasive set of procedures, we do like to see research participants receive a copy of the informed consent document before they show up that day. We don't want them having to make a decision then there on the spot about whether they'd like to participate. So it's okay if you don't obtain informed consent from them directly, like before they arrive, but they do need to have the opportunity to review that information and review it with somebody that cares about them or that they care about their opinion, and come up with a list of questions that they'd like to ask you when they do show up for their research appointment. So that's a common procedure that we are asking folks to implement, that if you're planning that sort of study, you might consider incorporating into your informed consent process. But again, if you're really interested in talking about informed consent, I hope to see you at our March training, because we're going to spend a whole hour and a half just on that. So here are some helpful resources for sort of the regulatory and policy side of IRB approval. A really strong familiarity with the Belmont report, our summarization of the exemption categories and expedited review categories. And then we have a link just to our standard operating procedures, which we send to folks quite often. If you're doing research in an international setting, we have a whole SOP on transnational research. If you are thinking about compensation schemes, we have a whole SOP on compensation. We have a whole SOP on recruitment. And so that's a great place to go sort of directly to the source and learn about the standards for the area that you are interested in. We talked about confidentiality of data, and so I've provided USU IT data handling requirements here because another factor that goes into that section's review is, like, are you complying with the USU rules on how to store data? It's not just an ethical thing. It's research data collected by USU folks is owned by USU and needs to be treated in ways that comport with USU IT's and USU privacy's expectations. And then we, of course, have a link to our informed consent templates. And then these last two are, I hope, a little more helpful resources. So we have a consultation request form, and we typically are able to schedule you like within an hour of you submitting that form. We do ask that you give us 4 hours notice before you ask for a scheduling, just because we can't always leave a meeting or drop the protocols that we're working on in that moment to have a meeting. We wish we could. But that request a consultation form will get you scheduled rather quickly with one of our analysts or me, depending on the topic that you're asking about. And then we have an Ask the IRB Slack. So I don't know if you're familiar with Slack, and it's also failing us miserably today. I don't know if you use Slack, but Slack has been down pretty much all day today. But ordinarily, you can treat the Ask the IRB Slack as a sort of live chat. We are monitoring that between the hours of 8 and 5 during every day that USU is open. And so if you just have like a quick general question, we encourage you to use that as a mechanism for getting, like, you don't want a whole consult. If you do that, than all of us monitoring the same space. Usually one of us can get you an answer pretty immediately. It's just when you're requesting a consult about a particular project, we do want to match you with the person who's ultimately going to probably do the review on that protocol. And so that's a little more intricate, whereas the Ask the IRB Slack is great for like general questions. So those are two ways to get like really easy access to the experts within my office who are conducting the protocol reviews. So please do utilize those resources. With that, are there any questions?
Nicole, there's one additional question that came up earlier. So the question is, what if they're collecting data with indigenous youth or like Navajo students, but the data collection is not on tribal lands, like it's not on a reservation? And then they wrote, do I mark yes on that page? But I wasn't sure what page they were referring to. I'm sure you do.
Yes, I do. So uh, if so, you should reach out actually to the tribal entity that governs human research protections within that community and ask them that question. Some tribes exercise jurisdiction, whether it's on tribal lands or not. Some do not. And so that's not a determination that our IRB would be able to help you to make. Now, you said Navajo, Breanna, and I think, sorry, I'm so used to calling you Bree, that so my recollection, because we do have researchers who work closely with the Navajo Nation, my recollection is that they decline to exercise jurisdiction if you are not engaging on tribal lands. So that is just a specific piece of knowledge that I happen to hold. But my general advice is most tribes that are federally recognized have an infrastructure for obtaining permissions to conduct human subjects research. And their standards differ, so you should check in with them about what their standards are. Because some of them, I'm thinking some of the Paiute in Colorado do exercise jurisdiction regardless of where the research takes place.
Okay, we have another question. So it says, so does that mean my IRB would go through them 100% instead of USU?
That if you are engaging in that research as a representative of USU, it would be in addition to. So work with Indigenous and sovereign entities is one of the spaces where single IRB review is actually not required. And so this is one of the few spaces where duplicative IRB review might actually be necessary. Another instance of that is if you are doing research in the Utah Department of Health and Human Services settings, their IRB also doesn't do reliance, but their IRB also says that you must work through their IRB if you are if you are going to do research in those spaces, and they don't do reliance. So because they won't do reliance, we cannot rely, but because you are USU affiliated, you do have to have USU IRB approval on file. And so those are two examples that I can think of where you're going to be working with two IRBs.
Okay, another question. What if my participants include professors and I'm observing their Zoom space?
What if what?
Yeah, what if what?
Like what kinds of considerations are you wondering about there? Multiple IRB review, privacy concerns, informed consent issues.
Okay. What will be the ethical concerns?
Ethical concerns. All right. So anytime you're in an educational setting, you need to be cognizant of FERPA related concerns. So any space where an educational record about a student is being created or handled or discussed or looked at by a research team member, that would be something that you would need to be cognizant of. Another ethical consideration there might be that university classrooms are not like open spaces. So the indoors at universities are limited public fora, which mean that you cannot just waltz into any class and take a seat and be present in that space without going through some processes. So the people in that space might consider it limited might consider it private in a limited way. And so there are considerations about notifying the people who are in that space for a reason. For example, if you're walking into a classroom, students paid tuition to be in that space most of the time. And so making sure that you're sort of being communicative and open and honoring what they have done to be in that space. Those are some ethical considerations to consider. So, and also, adhering to FERPA. Let's see, things with regard to professors. One thing you might want to think about is if you're trying for an exemption. Exemption 1 requires that there not be any possibility of adverse impacts on the assessment of the educator in the space. And so depending on what you're looking at, you may need to step your level of review up and disclose those potential adverse impacts to the professors who you are observing. I'm not sure if that like fully covered a sort of observing of, and I will say I talked a lot about that in the terms of like an actual classroom, but for a lot of people these days, Zoom is the classroom. When we, since 2020, I think a lot of us tend to think about those things as interchangeable. And so a Zoom classroom space is a little bit different than just being in on a regular Zoom meeting. And so making sure to sort of distinguish between those two types of spaces would also be important.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay. Well then.
Oh, hold on one moment.
Oh, great.
Question. If we are observing teaching style on Canvas, then there might be risk-related disclosure of data submitted by students on Canvas. How should we handle this? Do we need to take informed consent from all students?
That's a great question. And so I will also encourage this person to visit the Research with USU Students training that we did last month, which we'll talk about all of this in greater detail, and it's recorded, it's on our website. But I will say that if you're in Canvas, you probably are going to interface with records of students that are identifiable. And FERPA does not have an exception for obtaining those records absent that student's permission. So HIPAA has exceptions for your health records, but FERPA does not have exceptions for your education records when you're accessing them in that way. But I will say, depending on the types of records that you're getting and whether they can be de-identified, the teaching and learning science. Oh, I'm forgetting their name. They used to be CIDI. They're the folks who sort of run Canvas and the other instructional design systems. They have a process for providing researchers with data that have been sufficiently de-identified to FERPA standards. They have a request form. That request form is on our website under the sort of useful resources for the research with USU students training that we did last month. And so depending again on what your research questions are and what you need, you could potentially get that information without getting informed consent from students if that information can be provided in a de-identified way by the data custodian here at USU. A third option would be to work with your college if your project is on one of the FERPA exceptions, which I don't have off the top of my head, but one of them is improving instruction. Then the dean's office can authorize you to access student records at USU. One of the trade-offs is that you do have to then return the results of your research back to the dean's office so that you can say that you actually did contribute to improving instruction at USU. But most dean's offices that we've undergone this process with are very happy to work with researchers on those sorts of things, as long as they can identify a tangible benefit to students in their college for the work that's being done. So a few options. I do talk about those in more detail in that January training, and we have links to some really helpful resources there as well. So,
Oh, they would like to know where they can access the recording of the webinar.
yes, if you go to irb.usu.edu under the training heading, It is called supplemental training, I believe. So if you click on training, there's required training and supplemental training. Yeah. And that supplemental training, the research with USU students is the third block on my page, I suppose, depending on the size of your page, it would look a little bit different. And so that's where we have the recording for that training, and also the Canvas data request form is listed there. So is our students as research participant guidance, and oh, I don't see our slides there actually. We'll get the slides up too. But just the slides and not the recording, but the recording is there.
Okay, any other questions? Looks like nothing is popping up.
Yay. A few minutes early. Well, I'll put in a plug for, there's that QR code again. We would love to hear from you about what you would like to learn about in fall of 2025. If not, I might just make the whole thing about informed consent, because again, I could talk for hours and hours about that. But our next two sessions are on informed consent waivers and alterations, which will include a discussion of the baseline informed consent processes before you can understand what the waivers and alterations are. And then April 28th is our I'm approved, now what? And so that's where we'll be talking about things like amendments and reportable events and closing out protocols that have been completed and what we're looking for on those pieces. So really hope to see you all there. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
Thanks, everybody.